Now, as you know, the theme of today is working together. Even before the lockdowns, instability was the defining characteristic of our labour market. Our welfare system has not adapted to the many changes in how people work and how they want to work. Knowledge Quarter organisations offer an abundance of career options and are at the forefront of the evolution of work in many new fields. But how can we ensure that such opportunities are afforded to everybody? We've had a year to reevaluate the benefits of working from home. How can we use this new understanding to make inclusive improvements to our working practices? We're going to look towards finding answers to these and other questions in our next panel, The Future of Working Together. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers for this panel. Jane Van Zyl became CEO of Working Families in September 2018. She has 12 years experience working in the third sector and has held senior leadership positions at a number of UK charities. She believes in the value of a fulfilling, balanced working life and its transformative power to create social connections, build self-esteem, and impact the wider community. She is a passionate advocate of equal opportunity for all. James Goodman is Director of Partnerships and Learning at Local Trust. He is responsible for developing and delivering partnerships, collaborations, and ideas that can support the long-term goals of the big local program and promote a positive future for communities through hyperlocal, place-based, resident-led change. James joined Local Trust from Forum for the Future, the internationally sustainability non-profit where he was Director of Futures and Projects. He has worked on a range of issues such as energy and climate change, social enterprise, the digital economy, sustainable food and agriculture, corporate sustainability, and the future of civil society. Gosh, so much there. Nishma Goswami, OBE. I think Nishma's trying to connect, a camera's trying to connect, but I'll introduce her and hopefully she'll be able to join us very, very quickly, or we'll be able to see her at least very, very quickly. Nishma is financial services partner at Bain & Company. Her work focuses on human capital transformation as well as the future of work and culture. Nishma has nearly 2 decades of Big Four consulting experience across geographies, throughout which she has architectured and deployed strategic people initiatives. Her breadth of expertise spans all facets of human capital, workforce strategy, reorganization design, cost reconstruction, and talent management. Nishma has been listed in the Financial Times' top 35 future leaders list. She was invested with an OBE in Her Majesty's 2020 Honours List for services to diversity and inclusion, pioneering gender pay gap reporting and the subsequent changes to the Equality Act. She has been honoured with numerous other awards, including Asian Professional of the Year at the Asian Achievers Awards, and was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. She's no stranger to the Knowledge Quarter. She holds a degree from University College London, where I met her for the first time 20 odd years ago. And also she studied at the London Business School. Our participatory chair for the session is Jack Salabank, a researcher, innovator, and writer, and founder of Future Places Studio, a place-based research and strategy studio. He consults in Hammersmith and Fulham Local Authority on their industrial strategy and economic response to COVID-19. He's the co-founder of a recruitment startup called Bricks, which is on a mission to place young people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds into entry-level employment positions in the knowledge economy. Thank you all for joining this panel. I'm going to hand it over to Jack.
Thank you very much, Bav. Jane and James, I imagine you're nervously hoping that Nishma joins, otherwise you've got a lot more work to do. Nishma, you've arrived just in time. Fantastic.
My apologies.
No, you were here just in time, so you're perfect. Before we get started, Bav, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you to everyone for joining this afternoon's conversation, and also thank you to the Knowledge Quarter for hosting this conference. It's a hugely important topics that you guys are tackling as part of this conference, so thank you for taking the lead on that. Now, we don't have a huge amount of time, but we have some big topics to try and get into, so I'm going to dive straight into questions. First of all, and Jane, be prepared, I'm coming to you first off the bat. Now, as Bav said, one of the challenges that we are looking at existed pre-pandemic, and that is the challenge of inclusive growth, how areas such as King's Cross and the Knowledge Quarter can evolve not only as economic beacons, but importantly, areas that promote and enable inclusive growth. And fundamental to this concept of inclusive growth is around creating better jobs, better job opportunities for the local communities that exist in and around the Knowledge Quarter. So Jane, first of all, from your perspective and your experience, how can areas such as the KQ and the member organisations that make up the KQ go about enabling more resilient job opportunities for the local communities to really achieve this ambitious ambition of inclusive growth?
Hello, everyone. Delighted to be here, and thanks for that question, Jack. For us, for working families, flexibility is the key. Flexibility allows people to manage their caring responsibilities and their work life. And certainly the big thing that I would add in is paying people the living wage. That is, from our perspective, absolutely vital. We hear from parents, working parents and carers all the time, who simply don't get enough hours to work and they're already working 2 or 3 jobs. So some of it is about ensuring that people actually have enough money to live on. And the rest then is about ensuring that people have the flexibility to be able to do the job they want to do, but also manage that with their caring responsibilities. And there are some really easy things that organisations can do. Look at the job design. Can it be done? Look at the ways in which you're recruiting people. Are you being reasonable about what you're expecting? So, for example, if you're looking at start a job, to say to somebody, you must have a 3-year degree. Really? What's the point of that? If it's for a very specific function, then absolutely. Train line managers. Make sure line managers understand what needs to be done and that they are as flexible as they possibly can be. But you can't ask line managers to do something differently if you don't show them how to do it. Advertise jobs flexibly, all jobs. Zurich Insurances have the most extraordinary success with their new recruitment campaign. And they've had 30% increase in applications across the board for all of the jobs they are advertising flexibly. And then culture change needs to be led from the top. The people that you're employing have to see that actually what the person at the top is talking about, they are also visibly modelling. So it's fairly easy.
Oh yeah, simple. And Jane, we're going to pick up in a little bit more detail into some of that in a minute. But first of all, James, I quickly want to come to you and really thinking about a similar question, but through the lens of your experience. And Jane has sort of answered that from the perspective of what organisations can do. From your experience of working with local communities up and down the country, what is it that you think that they need with regards to support when it comes to this challenge of trying to move them closer to resilient job opportunities?
Thanks for the question. Yeah. So just to tell you a little bit about the perspective that I come from in answering that question. Local Trust is a charity with an endowment from the National Lottery to run the Big Local programme. The Big Local programme, it's quite a radical venture that was set up by the lottery about 10 years ago to kind of turn around grant giving and the way that local communities are supported, based on an observation that it's really difficult to get grant funding from foundations, charity foundations, but also from government into communities that really need it. And that, if you think about a lottery, there's a lot of communities playing the lottery a lot, putting money in and not necessarily getting money out. And one of the reasons for that is that there's just not the awareness of grant opportunities or the capacity to fill in grant applications and participate in what is normally a competitive process to get money. And so the idea is to turn it around a little bit and almost like a kind of a universal basic income for communities, just choose 150 places that really had been missing out on funding, and just offer them the money. And so 150 places were chosen across England, small places, neighbourhood level, communities of around 8,000 people, and they were offered £1 million, just over £1 million, to spend over a period of 10 to 15 years on improving their locality. And those decisions to be made by residents, and with 10 to 15 years to spend money, that's a lot longer than normal grant programs. So what that does is it makes a foundational investment in the community and the way that the community functions, and leads over time, and our research is showing this, it leads over time to increases in confidence in the people who are involved in the program, and increasing sense of agency. And there are stories after story of people who just get involved as a volunteer on the periphery, or go along to an event, then start getting involved in running things, and then before long, they're chair of the group. Being given those opportunities is incredibly important. So increases in individual power, sense of power and agency, and then that laddering up to the community actually being more active and organized and being able to cope with challenges. And we saw this in the COVID pandemic, that the places that were participating in Big Local, partly because they had the money, the volunteers, but also the experience of working together, were able to respond incredibly quickly to the challenges of getting food and medicine out to people who were isolating, much more quickly actually than, in many cases, than local councils and the other public agencies. So able to cope with those challenges, but also able to take those opportunities. So, I think inclusive growth was the question, and there's an implication in inclusive growth that there's a show going on somewhere in the centre, and that needs, that whoever's running that show needs to include people from communities, diverse communities, and communities far from the centre. And I would challenge that framing in a way, and that it's the other way around. And we need to focus on investing in supporting how communities function, how people connect within their communities, and build up an economy from there, rather than including those places in a centralized economy.
That's a great point, James. And I think, again, something very interesting that we can try and sort of unpick over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Nishma, thank you for joining. Lovely to meet you. I want to come at this question to you, particularly from the sort of lens of the employer. And again, thinking around this challenge of inclusive growth, thinking about this challenge of employment opportunities, and if we kind of keep it contextual around the KQ, diversity and inclusion is obviously an increasing agenda amongst organisations. Again, you could argue that during the pandemic, it's been amplified and exacerbated. And of course, during the pandemic, during the last 18 months, of course, was the murder of George Floyd, which of course has kind of intensified the need for diversity and inclusion amongst organisations. Now, I'm going to take a optimistic view that diversity and inclusion could prove to be the sort of the unlocking of this inclusive growth opportunity. It's a difficult nut to crack, how you move people into resilient job opportunities. Could diversity and inclusion amongst organisations, if they are really focused on it and they truly commit to it, could it be the opportunity to help sort of unlock this pretty difficult challenge?
Thanks, Jack. I'm going to take that into two parts, if that's okay. It's quite a long question there. So if we just take a step back a little bit and think about what COVID-19 has done, and the scale of workforce transitions set off by COVID-19's influence, if you like, on labour trends, for example. there's a real, in my view, an urgency for businesses and policymakers to take steps to support additional training and education programs for workers. And as a result, companies and governments have exhibited extraordinary flexibility and adaptability. Of course, one could say that we could be doing a lot more in responding to the pandemic with purpose, in my view, with innovation, that they might also harness to retool the workforce in ways that point to a brighter future of work in lots of different aspects. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where I'm going with this, and then come back to the sort of diversity and inclusion point, which actually falls into where we take this. Businesses can start with, in my view, a granular analysis of what work can be done remotely by focusing on the tasks involved rather than the whole jobs. And I think they could also play a larger role in retraining workers. And we've seen a lot of that, I think, particularly in the last sort of 2 months with organizations like Amazon, IBM, etc. And others have facilitated occupational shifts by focusing on the skills that they need rather than, and I think this was pointed out earlier, on academic degrees. Remote work, I think, also offers companies the opportunity to enrich that diversity by tapping workers who, for example, wouldn't have necessarily been able to, because of childcare issues, for family or other reasons, unable to relocate to the superstar cities, as we call them, where talent, capital, and opportunities were concentrated before the pandemic. And certainly for the UK, that is very much London. And the US, one would argue, is that San Francisco. So I think it really makes a change in terms of what you're able to do, irrespective of the circumstances that you have as an individual. And then organizations are able to enrich that sort of diversity by tapping into those workers, particularly women who've been out of the workforce, for childcare reasons, etc., for a number of years. And whilst we've seen a number of programs in the industry inviting women who've been out of the industry for a while, it's not always been easy to integrate people back into the business. And so what this enables people to do is actually not have the sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years out of their organization. I think there's a real role here for policymakers in terms of how they support businesses by expanding and enhancing the digital infrastructure. So even in advanced economies, almost 20% or so of workers in rural households lack access to the internet. So governments have a role here. They could also consider, for example, extending benefits and protections to independent workers and to build their skills and knowledge mid-career. And I think that's really important so that we don't lose that sort of mid-career workforce, which is where a lot of the dropout happens, particularly in the most competitive industries, such as the one that I come from, financial services. Both businesses and policy makers could collaborate to support workers migrating between occupations. I think there's a lot of talk around that at the moment, and we're hearing about the Pact for Skills, which is being established by the European Union and has been during the pandemic. But actually, there's been sort of 7 billion euros enhancing skills of something like 700,000 automotive workers. While in the United States, organizations like Merck have, really sort of invested to burnish the skills of Black workers, for example, that don't have a college education, but can create jobs that they can fill. So I think, in a nutshell, the reward of such efforts would be a more resilient, and somebody mentioned that earlier as well, more talented and a better paid workforce. And in return, as we know, a more robust and equitable society.
Absolutely. And just, Nishma, staying with you for a second, you mentioned your own sector, the financial services sector. Do you see that type of change taking place within your sector at the speed that you would like to see it happen?
So, Jack, if we're talking about diversity and inclusion to start with, we're seeing the sort of change across financial services that we would like to. I think that the pandemic has accelerated the level of change, in that enabling people to work from home, enabling people to work flexibly and without adaptability means that we're going to see more women stay in the workforce. more individuals from ethnic minority communities where they may have had other responsibilities, being able to stay in the workforce as well. Do I think organisations have more to do to accelerate change at more senior levels, particularly across sort of senior management and executive committees? Absolutely, and that change for me is still too slow.
Okay, thank you, Nishwa. Important for me to say at this point that my understanding is that we are going to allow for 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this panel conversation for audience Q&As. So if you're not already, then please leave questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the session. Jane, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to move the conversation on. I mean, we sort of naturally gravitated to the kind of the post-pandemic work, and of course we're all sort of figuring out what the post-pandemic world of work will look like. I mean, it really feels like we're in a moment of opportunity to redesign the structures around how we work, where we work, when we work, to put people, employees, front of center of that redesign, and to make the structures of work for more people. I know that you guys have done a lot of work around this. What opportunities do you think exist as part of that redesign process?
We are excited about the future, absolutely. But a couple of things that I want to say. The pandemic, just to think back, may very well have been this, everyone may have found themselves in the same storm, but very many people were in very different boats, very leaky boats. And the pandemic highlighted a lot of inequality. So while an enormous number of people were able to work from home in a remote way, even while trying to balance and juggle homeschooling and childcare responsibilities and elder care responsibilities and all of those kinds of things, not everybody was able to do that. So anyone with a place-based job, so you literally have to be where people are, the NHS, of course, anybody who's responsible for cleaning anywhere, anybody who's responsible for driving a bus, you have to be where that job is. They haven't experienced that. And I think we need to be very mindful of thinking that what government is now calling hybrid working is only one small part of flexible working. We'd say almost every job has some flexibility in it somewhere. Whether or not that is rostering by the team understanding what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, and how it needs to be done, and committing to one another as a team, but also to their employer to get those things done. We think that flexible working, and certainly the ability to work from home, particularly for knowledge workers, can be hugely positive for people with disabilities. Anybody who has mental health issues, anybody who needs to work in a slightly different way. So that is fantastic. And of course, organizations will have to provide the means for people to be able to do that, because not everybody had the same working from home experience. If you are in shared accommodation and you are spending your 8-hour day or your 7-hour day, whatever it happens to be, stuck in your bedroom, or if you're sharing a device, you can't do work. So the personal circumstances of the people that you employ needs to be considered. And you need to have equity across your ability to include people in. So where somebody may need an extra monitor because they've actually got a perfectly brilliant home setup, somebody else may need a laptop and a monitor and a keyboard and a mouse. So there are some challenges, even for smaller employers, about how they're going to afford these things. But certainly if you look at flexible working and you look at matching the job to what can be done, exactly as Nishwa said earlier on, then for us, we think there is going to be some transformative change. We certainly hope so.
And are you seeing the businesses leading that change, or do you want to see more from government in terms of advice and guidance, or do you think businesses should be doing that on a kind of case-by-case basis?
We did a YouGov poll earlier this year, over the summer, and we asked working parents what it was that they wanted. They all wanted more flexible jobs. 84% of them wanted that to come from businesses. 70 odd said they wanted that to come from government. Our experience is that larger organisations who are genuinely interested in the welfare of their people who work for them, because they understand that that is their capital, they are investing in making all kinds of changes. We would like to see, when the employment bill comes in 22 or 23, that government is committed to making jobs advertised as flexible, because we think that would help enormously. Larger organizations are able to do things in a different way, but it needs to be pushed down. So for us, it's a policy issue, but absolutely, we can learn from employers. We have a range of employer members who are small businesses and much larger businesses. And the ability, that the things that they've been doing over the year over the last 18 months have been extraordinary. And again, last summer, we asked them what was happening within their businesses. And all of them said productivity was either remaining the same or had improved. So standing over people isn't necessary. You can trust the people that work for you to do the job that they're given to do. So yeah, it needs to be business and government. And obviously, it's an employment relationship. So there needs to be flexibility for both sides, for the employer and for the employee.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. James, I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to pick you up on an earlier point that you raised as part of your first answer around inclusive growth. And that's particularly your I suppose, perspective about how inclusive growth is framed, and actually it shouldn't be about big organizations trying to invite communities in, and actually framing it slightly differently. I agree wholeheartedly with you that realistically making that happen is obviously a much bigger challenge. And again, if we think about the kind of the KQ area and the speed of growth that area has kind of seen over the last 15 to 20 years, but also the industries which now call that area home, artificial intelligence, robotics, deep tech, deep science, moving at a really rapid pace, and a pace which again risks leaving a lot of people behind. So taking your perspective, how do you balance those two together?
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary place, isn't it? And I think you're probably going to cover this a bit later in the conference as well. But there's this sort of notion of trickle down, that sort of wealth and sort of innovation and insight and agency kind of spreads out. I think that's been challenged, and that actually the extraordinary power and resources that are there in the Knowledge Quarter, there's some effort to be made to actually involve local people. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can be done around local procurement, but obviously the skills need to be there, the right businesses need to be there. So there's a lot that could be done in fostering those skills and fostering those businesses to develop in the local area. Getting involved in the neighborhood plan, working with local people and making sure those local people not only have the opportunity to have a voice, but have the capacity and confidence to participate in conversations with people on an equal footing, people who are maybe sort of coming from a professional background and doing it from a paid point of view, but they're doing it as volunteers who love their community and in their spare time. There's a real imbalance of power there. So there's all that stuff that can happen within the specific area where businesses are based. But and I think it's very important to acknowledge there is poverty in the local area, and there is inequality, definitely. But there is also a huge opportunity to sort of, I suppose, engage communities far beyond the KQ area because of the travel to work patterns that are there. And this is the opportunity that comes out of more working from home for those people who are able to. I completely agree with Jane that this is not the whole workforce by any means, but a lot of people will be commuting in to the stations there, tube and so on, and will be spending their opportunities to spend more time in their communities. And so there's an opportunity to foster some of that foundational growth in those communities beyond, highly resourced central London. Can I pick up on what Jane was saying, actually, if that's okay, about the
Please do.
inequality of the impact, or the way that different people in different boats, because that really applies to communities as well. And not only were certain communities much more hit directly by the health crisis, but were actually helped much less as well. And the sorts of communities, there's some really interesting analysis that we've done at Local Trust, which looks at the role of social infrastructure. If you look at the most deprived communities in terms of economic performance and so on, in terms of poverty, and then you look at the communities which are actually just as deprived, but are also lacking in institutions or organizations that are locally rooted, in places to meet, and in connectivity, digital connectivity, transport connectivity, and so on. They're just as deprived, no more or less deprived, but their outcomes are much worse. Then their outcomes are worse in terms of skills, in terms of employment, in terms of job density, pay, health outcomes, and crime, and a number of other areas. It's this social infrastructure really makes a difference. It even made a difference in the response to the pandemic. So places lacking in social infrastructure were half as likely to have a mutual aid group than similarly deprived areas that had social infrastructure. So people weren't organizing, people weren't responding. So, I see the opportunity of much more flexible working and so on. Yes, there's an opportunity within the central area, but there's an opportunity to foster that social infrastructure and participation in a much greater range of communities, and get those communities functioning, which means the fabric is there to support people when they want to get into jobs, get into employment, and improve their local neighbourhoods.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Nishma, the title of today's panel is the future of working together, and I'm always interested when speaking to different organisations, particularly large organisations such as Bain & Company, to understand what the future of working together is for your organisation post-pandemic, and maybe you're still figuring that out. What are the early kind of learnings that you've taken from the pandemic, and how do you think they will be applied going forward, and particularly thinking in context of Jane's response and how Bain & Company can kind of take some of those learnings?
Yeah, I mean, Jack, I think that a lot of it has been covered, although, I could come at it from a sort of broader professional services perspective, and that would be focused around the adoption of digitization and automation technologies. And that has really accelerated how we intend to work going forward. So, as we all know, there are unprecedented restrictions on travel, physical interactions, although, we're looking to come out of this sooner rather than later. We know that there are going to be changes in consumer behavior since COVID-19 took place, which has forced organizations like mine and others to really think about the way in which consumers change the way they operate. And so what it's done in turn is spurred digital transformations in a matter of weeks, rather than months or years, and so non-essential workers have shifted to working from home. We did a big survey around our executives, and the results were that 85% or so came back to say that businesses have somewhat or greatly accelerated the implementation of technology that digitally enable employee interaction and collaboration, such as video conferencing, file sharing, employee interaction, etc. Can do. And roughly half of those surveyed reported increasing digitization of customer channels, for example, via e-commerce, mobile apps, or chatbots, etc. So, there's a real sort of change around that digitized supply chain, for example, by connecting suppliers with digital platforms in supply chain management. And I think that when you think of that adoption of automation technologies, including robotics. I think you mentioned autonomous vehicles and AI-driven software that can perform process workflows. It really sort of makes us as an organization think about whether we actually need to be, back in the office. I mean, there is a big aspect of you need to be able to meet your clients and your customers, and there is little that can change the face-to-face interaction. But there are trends reflecting automation's ability to facilitate contactless interaction, for example, at a time where, although social distancing rules will be lifted, and there will still be heightened awareness of hygiene as well as cost pressures, right, that will arise from an economic slowdown caused by the pandemic. So, there's a lot for us as an organization to think about, but also what our clients are going to be doing. As you pick up the newspapers, lots of organizations make big statements around there is no need for any employee to come back to the office. If you do think you need to come back to the office, then you need to sort of go through the HR process, etc. And I think that as a lot of retail looks at their sort of proportion and size in the city in particular, there'll be a lot of focus around cost pressure, the slowdown, and then the awareness of how, a certain part of the population still isn't double vaccinated, and what do we do around that going forward? Large training events, for example, will they take place in the way they have historically? And one could also argue that the robotics has had such a huge impact on the way that we do business now that, when you think about cost pressures in particular, a statement came up on a call that I was on this morning, and somebody said, well, actually, the great thing is robots don't get sick. So there's a real reason why we need to move to a completely different way of thinking about what we do. I mean, we have seen through the pandemic how supermarkets, Amazon, etc., have completely changed consumer spending. The availability of cloud services, for example, has really announced plans to step up investment as an indication to demand-related change in the workplace. And I think that doesn't just focus on private sector employees, but of course the community as a whole in terms of access to the way they do things. So in a nutshell, I would say that we're still in the process of thinking about what this is going to look like going forward, as are many other organisations. But there is certainly a need to combine seeing people and developing relationships and ensuring that you're looking after your employees and their well-being in particular, as much as there will be cost pressure due to an economic downturn.
Absolutely. Jane, just on that point of Nishma's with regards to her own organisation still figuring this out and other organisations doing the same, there does seem to be a bit of a split though with some company CEOs and chairmen coming out and saying the office is the only place that you can do work, so as soon as we can, you're back in the office. Do you think, sort of maybe looking fast forwarding a couple of years, for those organisations that don't kind of move with these very rapid times, if you like, it could have an impact on their ability to recruit and retain talent if they don't respond to the changes that have happened over the last 2 years?
Yep, absolutely. Sorry about that being muted. Always happens.
You've had 18 months to get used to it, Jane.
I know, terrible. So what we're seeing when we ask working parents and carers is so many of them are telling us now is that the first thing that they will look at if they're looking for a new role, if they're looking to move, is how flexible is the job. And that's going to be their primary consideration, particularly for working parents and carers, where what's happening at the moment is that a lot of childcare settings are closing. And we think that's going to accelerate as we come out of the autumn. That's going to be an issue for so many parents. Now, you can't, working from home is no substitute for childcare. So we're not in any way advocating that people should work for home and have 4 or 5-year-olds around them. That's not going to be okay. But for many employers, we think that if the flexibility isn't there, it is going to be difficult for them to get the kind of talent that they want, both at a senior level and then also people to come in to do the entry-level jobs. Anecdotally, I've been very interested that a lot of the young people I know who are in their first or second jobs are really enjoying flexibility in terms of the ability to work from home occasionally, because actually they don't want to spend an hour and a half on the train every single day, much as they love going into these big super cities. And they also find that the gym around the corner is actually cheaper than the one next to the office. So for us, what we're hearing from working parents and carers, who after all are more than 40% of the working population, is that flexibility is going to have to be considered for them. And that's certainly what we are seeing. At the moment, though, time-wise, tell us that only 2 out of 10 jobs are advertised flexibly. So the other thing we think that organisations are going to have to think through is, if they're not advertising jobs flexibly, will they be in a position where they're stuck with a whole lot of people working for them who've got the flexibility they want but can't move on? So however much they're increasing their training budgets and however much they are upskilling those workers, actually they want to go somewhere else, but they're stuck because of the flexibility they have.
Absolutely. So we've got roughly 4 or 5 minutes before we turn to audience questions, and I'm pleased to see that, just looking in the chat, a few questions have been raised. So panel, be prepared, because I think they look harder than the questions that I'm asking you at the moment. But James, before we do that, I just want to quickly sort of explore your experience in terms of working with local communities, and particularly with empowering them, but also giving them cold hard cash to do something for their local community as well. And King's Cross, we know the area as obviously a hotbed of incredible anchor institutions, but also a real hotbed of startups and scale ups. Now, again, back to this kind of inclusive growth agenda, what you ideally would like to see is that some of those new startups coming through are indeed coming through from the local communities. So local communities having the opportunities, to create and grow their own businesses, which ultimately, can one day sit alongside the existing businesses in the KQ area. From your experience, how do you kind of make that work? What are some of the learnings you've seen over the last couple of years of your project? Like I say, particularly when you start to give communities cold hard cash and you give them the infrastructure to support them to move their ideas forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yes, remember, when the money is theirs, we don't give it to them. They make the decisions about how it's spent, and we just sort of monitor and sort of administer in the centre. And another thing to say about that is, sometimes it's not the spending the cash that matters, it's having the cash, which gives the confidence and opens the door. And some of the big local partnerships that have achieved most and have moved most quickly and have the most ambitious plans haven't actually spent a huge amount of their money, over halfway through the programme. But having said that, well, clearly improving the local economy and employment and so on is something that a lot of the communities really want to see happen. They go about it in an incredibly diverse way, and many of them do what I've been talking about, which is, they really focus on engaging the community and in fostering a sense of community and connection. And the stuff that goes on there is everything from a knit and natter, which you've got people sitting around having a cup of tea knitting. Maybe they've got their kids around there as well, and that's that's bringing people into a space where they can start the process of self-realization, to community events where they're celebrating the culture of food and so on. All of those things are investing in that foundational functionality of community. You need that in order to get onto that tougher stuff. But some of that tougher stuff is, it is like giving small grants to people who've got business ideas. There's one big local partnership in Kent that has an innovation hub. They've taken on a building from the council that was disused. It used to be a supermarket. It was lying empty. They've taken it on at a peppercorn rent, and they've done it up, and they've opened it up to micro entrepreneurs. So on very, very short lease, 1 month notice, very low rent. It's an opportunity for people to try out business ideas without making that much commitment or taking that much risk. And at last count, I think there was something like 23 small businesses in the building, and they were opening up couple of times a week for people to come in and buy stuff and so on. And 2 or 3 of those had actually made the jump and taken somewhere in the high street. They're performing that function of fostering the confidence and skills and connection that gives people an in into the local economy. In direct contrast, actually, to the council. So I haven't said exactly where it is, have I? So I think I can get away with this. Council, which spend a lot of money on building a new shopping precinct, tens of millions of pounds. So maybe 100 times what this innovation hub cost, which was then occupied by shops and so on that were from outside of the area, whose supply chains were global, and whose sort of management staff weren't sort of sited locally either. And obviously there's a space for that and there's a role for that. But in contrast to the fostering of the local stuff, somebody described it as almost like putting a big suck pipe in the middle of the town centre and switching it on and extracting the value out of the place. So just an example of how bottom up can work, basically.
That's brilliant. Thank you, James. Okay, guys, I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions. And Jane, I think this one is probably for you first off. And it's come through from Brian. So Brian, thank you for typing this up. Jane, when it comes to flexibility, there's a tension between the expectation of employees versus what employers are prepared to accommodate. Where's the tipping point where an employer can no longer provide sufficient flexibility to retain employees who want a degree of flexibility they can't be given?
That's definitely one for me. We're very clear as a charity. We know that people have employment rights, but the bottom line is that it's a relationship where you are being paid by somebody to do a job of work. So while we would encourage employers to look at the job to see what can be done flexibly and what can't be done flexibly, there will be an element of many jobs which can't be done flexibly. And that's where communication between the employee and the employer will help everybody understand what's possible and what's not possible. We think we're in a unique position as a charity because we have a free legal advice helpline. So we understand from people who are being mistreated and who are being treated illegally what the problems are. But we also work with good quality employers who show us what is possible. So it's those two views that we use to advise people. And there are jobs that need to be done in a particular way, during particular hours, at a particular place. And if you're going to take that job, then actually you need to understand that. We would argue there must be flexibility within the role, which can be tweaked, especially if you try things out first and see whether or not they work. And then, of course, the other thing about any job is that it's got to be paid properly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. Okay, we've got a great question here from some students at Regents High who are listening to today's conversation. And with thanks to Richard Harrison for sending this question across. Given that the KQ is based in King's Cross, do you feel that the organisations here have a responsibility to the people who live and work here, especially the younger members of the community? And Nishma, I'm going to come to you with that question. So big anchor organisations, should they have a greater responsibility to the local community?
I think, Jack, that I think organisations have a responsibility to ensure that they are providing equal access to training facilities, etc., to enable young employees that live in the area to be equipped with the skills to be able to go into the marketplace confidently and with resilience. I think that. But it's a two-way. It's two-pronged, really. I think that young people also have to be able to, reach out. They need to go out and really make an effort as well in terms of getting the access, but also in terms of ensuring that they're equipping themselves in the best way possible to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are open to them. And I think sometimes that there is a breakdown in that communication between both parties, and often I've seen that. So I think there's more for everybody to do.
But I think picking up on that, I mean, sort of from my experience and speaking to people in local communities who live on the doorstep of big anchor organizations, I think often they feel like there isn't that opportunity even to start with, that they are sort of locked out before they've even tried to kind of get into the front door, if you like. And if organizations are true to what they're talking about in terms of diversity and inclusion and representing all of the communities in which they belong, then they need to do more to engage those communities. Would you not agree?
I would agree, and I think a lot of I mean, there is a lot more to do. I think we all know that, but there are a lot of organisations, particularly, I can say that Bain are offering a number of scholarships, for example, to those who don't necessarily or historically have met the criteria, perhaps, that we would have at entry grade to join our organisation. In the same way, we are using technology to be able to monitor individuals who perhaps wouldn't have had the same privileges as those who've been to have had a private education or been to Oxbridge, for example, but are extremely bright individuals who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, in underprivileged parts of the country. And what we do is we use a system which enables us to monitor what would that individual have been, had they had all the privileges across a period of time, from the time they were, we start at age 10 up until they were sort of 21, etc. And it's a very effective way of us then being able to bring people into the organisation. But Jack, this is something new that organisations have got on board with. The Black Lives Matter movement has accelerated this to some extent. And of course, all of the dialogue that we've been having on diversity and inclusion over the years, from gender to race and ethnicity and various other aspects of diversity, which are equally important. But we're not there yet. And, there is a lot more that needs to be done. I think the question is very valid in terms of how do we actually support within those local communities. And I think there's an education piece here for policymakers, government, organisations and society, where the dialogue isn't as robust as it might be.
James?
Yeah, sorry, could I just come in there? I think it's a really good question. I think that businesses often spend a lot of time and money and effort from a very good place trying to engage the local community. But I think sometimes the process doesn't work that effectively, and how businesses work with local communities can change and improve. And it is hard, but part of it is recognizing the innate power imbalance that is there. And again, part of the cue is in the terminology. Businesses engaging community, doing community engagement. On whose terms is the engagement taking place? How does it look if there's a little bit of sort of power shifting and a shift in the balance of power, and thinking, this is their community, this is our community. How do you want to, how do we engage you in decisions and so on? So looking at how to, I suppose, give the terms of engagement more to the people in the community to allow them to shape the priorities of the community more, and see how businesses can fit into that, I think is an interesting direction things are starting to move in.
Absolutely. And Jane, I'd like to come to you with the same question. And I think you mentioned at the start, you sort of questioned, do all organisations, for example, need to recruit someone that's got a degree and 3 years experience? And for a lot of people, the entry level funnel is narrowed very, very quickly, and possibly based on sort of requirements which maybe aren't needed as much anymore. Do you think that there is a case to sort of widen that funnel at the start point to enable a lot more people to access these job opportunities?
Absolutely. We would argue that a lot of that can be, that the opening up can happen through good quality job design. So if you look at the job that needs to be done, what is required in order to do that job? And there are lots of jobs which are advertised as requiring a degree, which absolutely don't need a degree. On the other hand, if you do need to have a qualification to do that job, then it's absolutely reasonable for the employer to ask for that. We've started using a blind recruitment software tool, and we've found absolutely fascinating that the questions we ask within this recruitment tool are around what would you do when? How would you resolve this? And it's all very much work-based. And we've very recently, for a charity that believes in flexible work, we've recently recruited somebody who came at the top of these questions, but had actually been out of the labour market for 4 years. And we may not have put her at the top of our list of jobs, the top of our list of candidates, if we'd seen her CV first. But of course, what that means is that the person being recruited needs to know that's where they need to go to see the job. They also need to have access to IT in order to fill all of that out. So there are some challenges around that. But we do see a lot of organisations doing a lot to try and open up opportunities. And then once they have people within them, to train them as much as possible. There is this question about we can't find the people we need to fill jobs. Well, what have you been doing with your training budget for the last 10 years? Because if you cut it, no wonder there aren't the people around, because everybody else is doing the same thing.
Absolutely. And Jane, just sort of staying with you for a second, and again, it's another question that's come through. So obviously recruitment is one thing, but then retention, development and progression it is another thing. Again, once you've got people from, say, disadvantaged backgrounds, as this question asks, into these job opportunities, there is then surely a sort of a challenge or an imperative among the organisation to support those people to sort of accelerate up through the organisation as well.
Absolutely. I mean, most organisations all organisations will absolutely want to hang on to the people that are working for them that are doing a really good job, because to replace somebody who's doing a good job is hugely expensive for an employer. There's the lost time, there's the recruitment process, there's the lack of knowledge, there's the onboarding somebody. So it is in the interests of the employer to keep that person with them. And many organizations will be putting a lot of money into training and retaining people. And there are many organizations out there that will be doing a lot to hang on to women, particularly as they become mothers, because we know there's very little gender pay gap between men and women up to age 40. It's after that it starts widening. And I think I'm right in saying that the gender pay gap is going to take 100 years to fix, which frankly is too long. But organizations do have wonderful retention, recruitment, and progression policies. But it's again about that employment relationship, is finding out what they are and trying to get into them.
Absolutely. And Nishma, you were nodding in agreement with Jane there.
On the gender pay gap piece, absolutely. Yeah. And the stats are actually quoted were spot on in terms of, as you get sort of past that mid-career piece over 40, it's much more evident that there is a difference across both in the public sector and in the private sector. And it's, it will take us up to 100 years at the pace that we're at the moment, even with increased scrutiny, now regulation across a number of industries, and the transparency required to, sort of talk about succession planning more openly on your website, etc. But there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done by communities, but primarily by organisations.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm conscious that we have probably now over time, and I'm presuming that this is where Bav steps in and tells me to stop talking.
Thanks so much, Jack. I think we have almost run out of time. Just a minute to go before the panel officially ends, but I just wanted to say a massive thank you to all of our esteemed speakers, Jane Van Zyl, James Goodman, Nishma Gosrani, and brilliantly chaired by Jack Salabank. Thank you all. We could have carried on, and like I said at the beginning, that this conference is just the first part. We want some of these conversations to carry on, and we might invite you back again to speak more directly to some of our Knowledge Quarter partners. I think there's so much we can learn from all your wealth of experience. So thank you so much. And just to also say that this conference our principal sponsor is British Land. So a massive thank you to all the good folks at British Land for continuing to support the Knowledge Quarter. It's the third year that they've sponsored this conference.